Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and welcome back to Spiritual Perspectives. We are looking at the Islamic science and the contribution of Muslim scientists towards the present era or the present science where it has reached. As we said, Islam is not just a religion but also a basis of a vast civilization spreading from Atlantic to the Pacific. Islamic science or the sciences developed by Muslims from second Islamic century onwards. Great achievements of Islam and the Muslims is fascinating, and we were looking at how the astronomy, in the field of astronomy, we find scholars such as Nasiruddin Tusi and his student, who was Qutbuddin Shirazi, who both of them contributed together towards the field of astronomy. And as a matter of fact, the revolution of the orbits, which is of the great scientist Copernicus. He writes on the revolution of orbits and how these planetary bodies, how they used to move, and the method of calculation which was done by Qutbuddin Shirazi, known as Nihayatul Idrak, translated as the limit of comprehension. Then later on, his student Ibn Sa'atir, he contributed towards this writing, and he talked about the new methods for the calculation of the movements of the planets and a new model which has come to be called the Tusi couple. It was known as the Tusi couple. And this model consists of joining two vectors, one at the end of the other, to explain the various motions of the planets rather than taking a recourse of the epicyclic system of Ptolemy. Instead of that, it followed a new sort of method by criticizing the Ptolemaic system or astronomy, and then giving it as a new sort of approach to the planetary movements, which was eventually mentioned by Copernicus in 16th century, which is way after where Ibn Sa'atir talks about this in the book of Revolution of the Orbits. So the same we tend to see in regards to in the field of geography or geology. If you look at those who've been credited in the 19th century, the European explorers were given the honor of finding the source of the river Nile. However, the source of river Nile was already discussed by Ibn Idris in his works, and especially where he have drawn geographical maps in the Sicilian court of Frederick the Great. So you have Muslim geographers. You have, for example, in the 3rd century, Biruni. Then eventually the Al-Biruni's works were concluded by Al-Idris, who really amazingly discusses geography, and geographical maps came into existence. The figures such as Ibn Hawqal and Al-Biruni, who wrote many works. Then also the navigators, like such as Henry the Navigator, Columbus, Magellan, all of these navigators who discovered India, who went across the Atlantic, they all utilized the research and contribution of Islamic empire, or if you want to call Muslim scientists. They were the one who contributed towards these sciences. They talked about Indian Ocean, they talked about Africa, they talked about the Mediterranean, and with the scientific background of astronomy, for example, Al-Biruni, whose contribution is also seen in astronomy, who kind of investigate geography as well. Then after that is the field of physics. In the field of physics, once again, you would find Ibn Sina, for example, who also have contributed towards geology as well. But Ibn Sina also talks about works in the book which is called Inclination. Ibn Sina's criticism is to be found in the development of the new doctrine of inclination, al-mail in Arabic, as it says. It is considered to be an excellent piece of work. Then you have in the field of physics, where the 14th century Christian 14th Christian centuries in the West, in the 13th and 14th centuries Christians, who prepared the ground for the scientific revolution. Obviously, you know who I'm talking about, Galileo, and his criticism of Aristotle. Aristotelian physics, Aristotelian planetary motion were also translated, were also discussed. Then later on, the discussion of Galileo and the criticism of it, of Aristotelian, was already done, was already taken care of within the Islamic civilization. And the discussion of Earth revolving around the sun was already discovered, were talked about. See, one thing that we need to know here is the approach of the Muslim scientists towards the science is keeping in mind the mabda, which is the creator, and also the ma'ad, if you want to call it the resurrection or the hereafter. So as Muslim scientist approaches a reality in that fashion, and he writes accordingly. And if he sees that the possibility of deviation of the community from the mabda and mad occurs, he would write it in a very secretive way that could be understood by his students and by the future students to come. So if Galileo discovers that, for example, sun is the center, earth revolves, the whole Christian foundation theology collapse with this discovery for a particular reason. Prior to Galileo, prior to the Western scientists, Muslims have already discovered that, and they have written extensively in a very secretive way that was understood by the elite. Even today, if you look at the Arabic texts and the way that the old text is written, is not a task of Tom, Dick and Harry to really understand what they have written. They write it so complex. The Qanun of Ibn Sina, I remember Ayatollah Misbah Yazdi, when he was delivering his lectures on it, on Isharat, where the first paragraph, in order to explain that first paragraph, it took for him 3 lessons, 3 45-minute sessions just to talk about that first paragraph. Why is that? The reason they wrote so in a very complex way is because those who are dedicated to the mabda, those who are dedicated to the sciences, and the purpose of, for those who understand the purpose of this science, they will be able to determine, or they will be able to understand and contribute sincerely towards the field. And if they write something that should not deviate the masses, that should not take away their iman, so that, because the community, or so that the layman, so that the common person do not have the capacity to really comprehend and understand that even if something goes beyond their imagination, still God exists. This is for those who are the scientists, they are aware of it. But for a lay person, it is not. Basically, hell breaks loose for them. They will not be able to really comprehend if something goes wrong. So, as we saw the downfall of Christianity because of the science, because they said religion is outdated, it goes against the science. The reason, because those scientists who approached the science was from a materialistic perspective, was not from a spiritual, divine perspective. If science is approached in a spiritual, divine perspective, then the science will, number one, unveil itself. It will allow the man to discover more and to contribute more, and at the same time the science will be utilized, will be a channel to establish the Mabda and Mahat, the creator, and the destroyer as well, because these are the two ends. And the scientist is trying to contemplate, analyze, investigate the journey of that reality, the harkat of that jawhar, of that substance. So when we look at the contribution of physics, for example, as we have mentioned earlier, their contributions in other fields, the peak of the activity in the science was reached in the 4th century in Cairo with Ibn Haytham. Ibn Haytham, the famous Latin Al-Hazan or Al-Hazan, known as, who is without doubt the greatest scientist in this field between Euclid and Kepler, and other major physicists of the 17th century who worked on optics. Al-Hazan is the author of Kitabul Manazir, known as the optical thesaurus, and one of the most outstanding works of the field, in the field of optics, is by him. And the method and the study how certain light phenomena and how we tend to see things because of the reflection was him. It was him who discovered that. He contributed that. Then when we are seeing something, it is because of the reflection of the light upon the upon the retina, and then we are seeing the images. And this was the beginning of it, beginning of the present research, where it has reached to this level, which was known as a refraction and reflection, and the properties of various kinds of mirrors. Mirrors included the hyperbolic mirror. Once again, it is by Ibn Haytham who provided this. Then we find that Qutbuddin Shirazi, student of Kamaluddin al-Farsi, who wrote a commentary on this book of Kitabul Manazir and explained it in a more precise, subtle fashion in regards to physics. Then you have, like for example, Ibn Baja of Spain, who talked about projectile motion, in a quantitative manner and apply mathematic formulas to study motion. Ibn Baja. As we already talked about Ibn Sina as well. Then we have the early 1609 Pisan dialogue. Galileo refers to Ibn Baja's theory. Galileo is referring to Ibn Baja's theory of projectile motion from the quotation which Ibn Rushd was also the philosopher. When we will be dealing with philosophers, history of Islamic philosophy, perhaps after this, we'll be looking at the two schools which were quite famous, the Aristotelian philosophy and also the Platonic philosophy that we tend to find within the Islamic philosophers. Ibn Rushd tend to take the more of a Aristotelian approach towards philosophy. So we have Ibn Rushd once again in the physics and his contribution as well. The third field of physics in which Muslims were interested was the whole question of weights, the question of measuring, the question of weights, that the tradition of Archimedes that we tend to see concerning the determination of specific weight and measurement of the weight and the volume and various objects which we see in his works, where really the Muslim physicist Al-Khazani, he was the contributor towards this field. Now, we talked about physics, we talked about geology, we talked about astronomy, we talked about mathematics and its contribution, and we initially started this discussion, the Baytul Hikmah, the translations. See, you have all of these different Muslim scientists approaching the different phenomena and reality around them. I will repeat once again by keeping in mind the Mabda and Ma'ad. Now, if we have time, perhaps we could get into the history of Islamic philosophy, which I would like to point out to from the beginning, where it talks about the definition of philosophy, how Greeks they defined philosophy as what philosophy really meant, and then eventually trying to point out to the contribution of the Muslim philosophers towards the philosophy, and today how this philosophy requires a revisitation of our Muslim of present philosophers. Just to coin the discussion, I will just mention a couple of things in regards to Islamic philosophy, and then we will leave it for our next program. To begin with, as we said, many tend to talk about that Islamic sciences, or Islamic sciences, which will also include obviously Islamic philosophy, is a continuation of the Greek philosophy. But when we will observe the discussions tonight or in our future programs, we would find that no, the source of Islamic philosophy is not really Greek philosophy, but rather it is the Quran, but rather it is the tradition, is the hadith, is the methodology of the Imams that we tend to see reflecting over and over again in the Islamic philosophy. The definition eventually given by the Greek philosopher is known as the knowledge of all existing things qua existence. So therefore the knowledge of everything that is existing, according to the Greek philosophers, it was known as philosophy. Knowledge of the divine and human matter, a definition given by Greek philosophers. Philosophy is becoming godlike to the extent of human ability, meaning that you should know the reality that is around you, in the same fashion as God would know the reality that is around. Like we said earlier, Al-Kindi was known as the first philosopher. For example, there's a quote that comes, philosophy is where Al-Kindi mentions in regards to philosophy when he's defining, because Al-Kindi was known as the first philosopher. So now he defines philosophy as with the word of falsafa, with the word of philosophy, because falsafa was not really a word that we tend to find in the Quran or in the Hadith, but we will look at what type of word is used in the place of philosophy. Now Al-Kindi, he says philosophy is the knowledge of the reality of things within people's possibility, because the philosopher's end in theoretical knowledge is to gain the truth, and in the practical knowledge to behave in accordance to the truth. So therefore philosophers end in theoretical knowledge is in order that they gain a methodology, in order that they practice philosophy. Then you have Farabi, who was known as the second teacher. Farabi was also a philosopher, and he mentions, or he defines philosophy as where he says while accepting the above definition of Farabi, he adds to it that distinction between philosophy based on yaqeen, which is certainty, and on opinion, hence dialectic and sophistry. He regarded philosophy as a mother of all sciences and dealt with everything that exists. Once again, very similar to the Greek opinion, or to the Greek approach in regards to philosophy. Then finally, we'll give one last definition of philosophy from Ibn Sina, where he says al-hikmah. Hikmah, he uses the word hikmah for philosophy. So we have a term, hikmat, which is actually from the Quran. Hikmat is the word used in the Quran in regards to philosophy, or hikmat is the word used in the riwayat and traditions. So Ibn Sina says al-hikmat, in the bracket I will say philosophy. Al-hikmah is the perfection of the human soul through tasawwur, through conceptualization. So hikmat, philosophy, is the perfection of the human soul through tasawwur of things, through conceptualization of things, and tasdeeq, which means referent, which means judgment, theoretical and practical realities to the measure of human ability. The ability that we have to comprehend and understand, to conceptualize, and to make a judgment of this conceptualization, or to see the reality of this conceptualization, is regarded as philosophy. Inshallah, we will look at further in regards to the definition of philosophy from the mystical traditions, such as we tend to find Ikhwanus Safa, the Ismaili, the Pythagorean thought which the Ismaili took, and then also Sohrawardi, which was a Neoplatonic approach to philosophy, which fall under the category of mystical traditions. And finally, looking at the Mullah Sadra, Sadruddin Shirazi, where how he has defined philosophy. Yes, thank you very much, and thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you next week again. Goodbye from Hidayat. Good night.